My parents spent my entire wedding fund on my sister's failing business and told me just a week before the wedding. My parents have always been pretty well off, thanks to their construction business. Growing up, my sister and I had a comfortable life, but she was definitely more spoiled than I ever was. I guess that's because she's the youngest, and my mom had her later in life. Just to give you some context, I'm 29, and she only turned 19 a couple of months ago. Let's call her Lucy. Lucy is the textbook definition of a spoiled brat, which is probably why we've never really gotten along. It's never bothered me much, though, being a whole decade apart, we don't have much in common anyway. But lately, she's been absolutely unbearable. No matter how ridiculously entitled she acts, my parents have never once put their foot down or tried to discipline her. Over the past few years, her grades have been going downhill, and she hasn't made the slightest effort to fix that. Instead, she spends all her time hanging out with her little clique, burning through my parents' hard-earned money like it's endless. If she's not out shopping, she's with her friends, acting like she doesn't have a single responsibility in the world. It used to drive me crazy because my parents never let me live like that. They were strict with me, made sure I worked hard and stayed disciplined. But with her? No rules. No consequences. Then, last year, she dropped the bombshell that she didn't want to go to college. Instead, she wanted to start her own business. Anyone with common sense could see that was a disaster waiting to happen. She had zero qualifications, and her idea wasn't even unique or exciting. She wanted to launch a denim apparel line using her own designs, but to be completely honest, they weren't anything special. I don't want to sound cruel, but they just weren't good. The problem was, her friends had pumped up her ego so much that she believed she was some kind of visionary. She was convinced this was her destiny, and no one could talk her out of it. My parents, unsurprisingly, caved in and agreed to fund her business. I told them straight up that it was going to crash and burn because she refused to take advice and insisted on doing everything her own way. And considering she had zero business experience, there was no way that was going to work out. I tried warning them, but they didn't listen. They went all in on her ridiculous plan, and eventually, I just gave up. There was no point in arguing. I figured I'd save myself the frustration and only talk to them about neutral topics whenever we met. Then, a couple of months ago, I got engaged, and ever since, I've been deep into wedding planning. I planned everything carefully, knowing that my parents would be covering most of the costs. They had been saving up for my wedding ever since I started dating my fiancée 5 years ago, so I never had a reason to doubt that the money was there. But just 3 days ago, only a week before the wedding, they hit me with the worst news possible. They told me that there was no wedding fund. Nothing. Not a single dollar set aside. Now, the real problem is, I've already paid for everything. I planned a big, extravagant wedding under the assumption that my parents were going to cover it, just like they always said they would. I'm not even being entitled here, they reassured me for years that the money was ready and waiting. Even as I booked venues and paid deposits, they kept telling me the same thing, pay for everything now, and we'll reimburse you in one go. It sounded reasonable, so I trusted them. If I had known there was no wedding fund, I never would have planned such a grand event. But now, here we are, guests invited, a massive venue rented, catering fully arranged, and every last detail locked in. It's way too late to cancel anything, and even if we tried, we wouldn't get any refunds. At this point, backing out would be pointless. What makes it even worse is that my fiancé and I have already spent a lot of our own money, believing we'd be reimbursed. Now that we know that's not happening, we're realizing just how much of a financial hole this has put us in. This wedding is going to drain our savings, and we're going to have to live ridiculously frugal for the next few years just to recover from this. Obviously, I'm furious with my parents. This whole disaster could have been avoided if they had just been honest with me from the start. Instead, they stayed silent, probably because they didn't want to admit the truth. Their pride was apparently more important than giving me a realistic picture of our finances. If they had just told me up front that they couldn't afford to pay for my wedding, I never would have gone all out like this. Had my parents just been honest with me from the start, I would have planned a wedding within my own means. That way, nobody would have been blindsided or hurt. But instead, they strung me along for months, letting me believe that the wedding fund was there, only to drop the truth on me just 3 days ago. I guess at some point, they realized they couldn't keep up the act forever and had no choice but to come clean. They invited my fiancé and me over for dinner, and everything seemed normal until dessert. That's when they casually dropped the bombshell, as if it was just another piece of conversation. They genuinely expected us to just accept it and move on. Their reasoning? Since we had already paid for everything, it must mean we could afford it anyway. I tried to explain that, no, we hadn't just magically had that kind of money sitting around, we had spent our personal savings, fully expecting to be reimbursed. And now, with that money gone, we barely had anything left for our future. But for some reason, my parents just couldn't grasp why this was a problem. They kept brushing it off, telling us not to worry, that everything would work out. I was still trying to get through to them when they finally admitted where the money had gone. And honestly, after hearing that, I knew there was no point in arguing anymore. As you might have guessed, they had poured every last cent of my wedding fund into Lucy's failing business. Her business had been floundering for a while, which was no surprise to me. She wasn't particularly talented at designing, nor did she have any real business sense. It should have been obvious to my parents, too. But instead of cutting her off when things weren't working out, they doubled down. Rather than letting her face reality, they just kept pumping money into her venture, trying to keep it afloat. At some point, without even realizing it, they had completely drained the wedding fund to bail her out. And by then, my fiancé and I had already been engaged for months. They had been promising me, reassuring me, that they would cover my wedding costs. But they couldn't bring themselves to back out or admit the truth because, according to them, it had become a matter of pride. That's why they had kept quiet for so long. And somehow, they actually thought I'd be understanding about all of this. They spoke to me as if it was no big deal. Like it was just a small inconvenience. At that moment, I realized there was no point in arguing anymore. So I forced a smile and told them it was fine. My fiancé was taken aback, but I think he could tell I had a plan. He didn't say anything, and we left as soon as we could. The moment we got into the car, I turned to him and said, "I'm not letting them get away with this." For years, I had tolerated their favoritism, let things slide, and held my tongue, because at the end of the day, they were still my parents. I didn't want to cut them off or hurt them. But it had become crystal clear to me that when it came to Lucy, they had no problem hurting me. They were willing to sacrifice anyone, me included, to keep her happy. And I had finally had enough. That night, I went home and put them on blast across all my social media accounts. I didn't hold back. Every bit of anger and frustration I had bottled up over the years just poured out. I detailed exactly what they had done, how they had promised me a wedding fund only to hand it all over to Lucy, and how they had lied to me for months. Within hours, my phone was blowing up. People reached out to console me, furious on my behalf. Some even offered financial help. It was clear that no one was on my parents' side, especially since everyone already knew Lucy wasn't cut out for business. They had all seen her being coddled her entire life, so they weren't shocked by her failure. But the fact that my parents had recklessly thrown away my wedding fund to support her and then blatantly lied about it, that made people angry. I knew it wouldn't take long before either Lucy or my parents tried to contact me, so I blocked them all. For 2 days, I had complete silence from their end. But today, I got a call from their lawyer. He told me I had 2 choices, take down my post, or my parents would sue me for defamation. Apparently, they were claiming that my post had caused them so much emotional distress that they'd be seeking financial compensation from me. The lawyer made it clear that they were giving me one chance to take it down. If I didn't, they'd move forward with the lawsuit. I was stunned. I couldn't believe they would go that far. So, after hanging up with the lawyer, I unblocked them and called my dad's number, fully prepared to let them have it. I wasn't about to let them threaten me into silence. I wanted them to know, loud and clear, that they couldn't just manipulate me into backing down. But when the call connected, it wasn't my dad who answered, it was my mom. And before I could even get a word out, she spoke, her voice cold and emotionless. She told me that after I had made my post, my dad had suffered a heart attack. She said they had never been so humiliated in their lives. That they had never expected me to stoop so low as to publicly shame them. That if I had a problem with what they did, I should have confronted them face to face instead of acting like everything was fine, only to turn around and air our dirty laundry online for sympathy. I was speechless. I had no idea my dad had been hospitalized. Nobody had told me. I tried to explain, tried to tell her that I didn't know what had happened, but she cut me off. She said, bluntly, that she didn't care. My mom made it very clear what was done, and as far as she was concerned, it was my fault. She gave me an ultimatum, either I take down the post and issue a public apology, or I live with the guilt of knowing that I had caused my dad's heart attack. She even admitted that they had messed up, that they should have been honest with me from the start. But in her mind, if I had truly respected them as my parents, I would have come to them directly instead of airing our dirty laundry online. Now, they believed that their money had meant more to me than they did as people. I had no idea how to respond to that. So, I just hung up. Of course, after that conversation, I couldn't shake the guilt. I never meant for my dad to suffer like that. The idea that a single post could have caused something so serious never even crossed my mind. But at the same time, I had no idea he even had heart problems. I was torn. I felt helpless, but I also didn't want to back down. The idea of publicly apologizing just didn't sit right with me. I couldn't explain why, but something about it felt off. A couple of hours later, I talked it over with my fiancé. Even he didn't know what to say. We both felt bad about my father's health, but at the same time, we didn't believe we had done anything wrong. We weren't the ones who had lied. We weren't the ones who had mishandled the situation. So why should we apologize for telling the truth? I struggled with that feeling for a while. And then, I found out something that changed everything. My parents had made the whole thing up. There was no heart attack. My dad was perfectly fine. They had lied just to manipulate me into taking down my post and guilt-tripping me into letting them off the hook. I was stunned. I couldn't believe they would stoop that low. And the worst part? If I hadn't gone looking for an update on my dad's health, I never would have found out the truth. 3 days ago, after making that post, I had tried calling my mom multiple times. No matter how upset I was about the wedding fund, I never wanted to believe that I had caused my dad to have a heart attack. That was never my intention, and I felt horrible about it. Even though I didn't feel like I owed them a public apology, I did temporarily take the post down after hearing about my dad's condition. But then, something strange happened. Over the past 2 days, my mom had ignored every single one of my calls and texts. Last night, after I had tried calling her 3 times in a row, she finally sent a message. She told me she wasn't ready to talk to me unless I apologized publicly. If I wasn't willing to do that, she said, then there was nothing left for us to discuss. I tried reasoning with her, but she ignored me. That's when I started feeling suspicious. Something about this didn't add up. Out of desperation, I decided to call my dad's physician. Let's call him Uncle Ron. He wasn't just my dad's doctor, he was also a longtime family friend. If anyone knew the truth, it would be him. Honestly, I don't know why I hadn't thought of calling him earlier. Maybe it was because I had been too overwhelmed. But as soon as I got him on the phone, I didn't waste any time. I fired off a string of questions, asking how my dad was doing, if the heart attack had been serious, whether he was still in the hospital, or if he was back home recovering. And Uncle Ron just sounded confused. He told me my dad was perfectly fine. In fact, he said, they had just met for dinner and drinks the other day. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I insisted that my dad had suffered a heart attack. After all, my mother had told me so herself. But Uncle Ron was certain. He reassured me that if my dad had experienced something that's serious, he would have known about it. And yet, he hadn't heard a single word. He even suggested that maybe I was just stressed from all the wedding planning. Then he hung up. I had a feeling he had put 2 and 2 together but chose not to say anything outright to avoid drama. And honestly, I was grateful for that. Still, I needed to see for myself. At this point, I was furious. I had spent days feeling guilty, debating whether I should apologize, all because my parents had deliberately manipulated me. I couldn't let that go. So, despite all the last-minute wedding preparations and the fact that my fiancé and I were supposed to drive to the hotel in the morning, I made the trip to my parents' house. I had to see it with my own eyes. I hadn't gone sooner because, deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that my dad really was in bad shape. Afraid that I'd have to face the consequences of my actions. But after speaking to Uncle Ron, I knew I had to go. And just as I suspected, my dad was completely fine. I don't think my mom expected me to show up. When I rang the doorbell, she refused to answer. I knocked again. And again. She still wouldn't open the door. Finally, I told her that I wasn't leaving until I saw my dad with my own eyes. She tried arguing with me, but I wasn't backing down. I kept knocking until she had no choice but to let me in. When she finally opened the door, she looked irritated, like I was the one causing problems. She told me I had no right to harass them like this. I ignored her and walked straight past her into the house. And there, in the bedroom, was my dad. When I walked into the room, my dad was sitting there, looking perfectly fine, sipping wine and casually working, like nothing had ever happened. The moment he saw me, he started fumbling over his words, scrambling to come up with an excuse. He tried to tell me that his heart attack had happened a while ago, so he was fine to drink now, and besides, he was feeling much better anyway. My mom, of course, jumped in too. She looked me dead in the eyes and said it was disgusting that I had actually come all the way here just to check if they had been lying about the heart attack. But at that point, I didn't need her to say it, I already knew. The way they were talking, the way they were acting, it was obvious they had been lying from the very start. They were trying to keep up the charade, but there was no point anymore. I had caught them red-handed. I felt so disgusted that I didn't even bother responding. I just turned around and walked out of the house without another word. When I got home, I unarchived my original post and put it back up. Then, I tried to calm myself down. I had already known my parents weren't great people after the whole wedding fund debacle. My expectations of them had hit rock bottom. But this? Lying about a heart attack just to manipulate me into apologizing? This was a new level of vile. I couldn't wrap my head around it. And the worst part was, they didn't do it because they regretted hurting me. They didn't do it because they wanted to make things right. They did it because they were desperate to save face. Their pride was more important than anything else. It was sickening. For years, I had brushed off their favoritism, convincing myself that it didn't matter. I told myself that Lucy was the baby of the family, that my mom had her later in life, and that maybe that was why they treated her differently. I tried not to resent them for it. I tried to be a good daughter. But yesterday, I realized something. There was no point in trying. They were never going to be good parents to me. And I was done pretending otherwise. After I put the post back up, I sat down with my husband and told him everything. He comforted me, then suggested that we just focus on the wedding for now. And he was right. We had driven to the hotel that morning, and by evening, most of our guests had arrived. Spending time with them, entertaining everyone, it helped take my mind off things. For the first time in days, I was able to breathe. Now, as I sit here in my hotel room, my husband fast asleep beside me, I realize that I just needed to vent. I don't want to let this mess ruin tomorrow. Tomorrow is a day I have been waiting for, dreaming of, for months. My worries about money, about my parents, about everything else can wait until the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow is about me and my husband. And honestly, that thought alone is enough to bring me some peace. Update 2. I got married 3 days ago. And honestly, it was one of the best days of my life. I had planned this wedding to be extravagant, and despite all the drama leading up to it, everyone showed up. People remembered my post, of course, and there were a few subtle nods to it, but no one made the day about that. No one brought it up to me directly, and for that, I was grateful. More importantly, no one mentioned my parents or Lucy's absence. And it wasn't even awkward, it was just peaceful. I had the most amazing time, but the best part? I don't even have to worry about my finances anymore. See, nobody stuck to the wedding registry. And for once, I was beyond grateful for that. Instead of gifts, all my relatives who had seen my post about my parents pulled their money together and wrote me a check for an amount big enough to cover the entire cost of the wedding. It wasn't a huge deal for most of them since my family is generally well off, but even so, the gesture meant everything to me. It wasn't about the money, it was about the fact that they cared enough to step in. They didn't make it feel like charity. They didn't make me feel pitied. They made me feel loved. And that feeling? Nothing in the world could replace that. In the end, my wedding was perfect, and I couldn't be happier with how things turned out. Oh, and my parents? They were nowhere to be found. For a while, I was actually worried that they might show up uninvited, so we had tightened security at the venue. But as it turns out, I had nothing to worry about. Because while I was getting married, they were on vacation. Yup. While I was walking down the aisle, Lucy was posting pictures from a luxury beach resort with my parents, captioning them, "Much-needed family vacation to get away from all the drama." The funniest part? She even used the hashtag #NotOurFam. It was beyond cringeworthy, but the message was loud and clear: I wasn't part of their family anymore. And honestly, I couldn't have been happier about that. I may be related to them by blood, but at least now, socially, we can stay the hell away from each other. Update 3. It's been almost 6 months since my wedding, and I've had zero contact with my parents. I still hear updates about them through other relatives, though. And last week, I found out that Lucy finally shut her business down. Apparently, she's decided to go to college now to get a business degree. Maybe one day, she'll try again, but for now, she's out of the game. The irony of it all? If she had just come to this conclusion earlier, none of this drama would have ever happened. My parents, of course, are fully funding her education. They enrolled her in one of the top business schools in the state, probably bought her way in, too, because there's no way she got in with her grades. She's been bragging nonstop about how elite the school is all over social media. And you know what? I'm not even shocked. They always had money when it came to Lucy. For me, though, they couldn't make a single sacrifice. Looking back, I should have seen their favoritism for what it was a long time ago. I should have taken offense way earlier than I did. But that was my mistake. And it's one I won't be making again. Because the truth is, I'm happy now. My husband and I recently found out that we're expecting. And in a couple of weeks, we'll be announcing it. I know my parents are going to try to get in touch when they find out. They'll want to be involved. But I won't let them. I've moved on. I have no expectations from them anymore. So it's only fair that they don't expect anything from me, either. I'm in one of the best phases of my life right now. I have my husband. I have a baby on the way. We're about to be a family of 3. And that's all I need to be happy. My parents? They just don't matter anymore.